When third-grade teacher Sarah Mitchell noticed 8-year-old Maya Rodriguez fumbling with a small plastic bag during math class, she assumed it was just another fidget toy or candy that needed to be confiscated. But as she approached Maya's desk, what she saw inside that bag made her blood run cold. Strange, unmarked pills in various colors and sizes, some crushed, others whole, all jumbled together like a dangerous rainbow. Within minutes, Sarah would make a call that would not only save a life, but uncover a heartbreaking family secret that would change everything she thought she knew about one of her most promising students. This is the story of how a teacher's sharp eyes and quick thinking revealed a crisis hiding in plain sight, and how sometimes the most innocent actions can mask the most desperate circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that teaching third grade was about more than just lesson plans and standardized tests. As she stood before her classroom at Riverside Elementary on that crisp September morning, watching 23 young faces look up at her with varying degrees of attention and enthusiasm, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had drawn her to education in the first place. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of room 15, casting geometric patterns across the colorful alphabet border that rimmed the walls, and Sarah could smell the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with the lingering aroma of breakfast from the cafeteria down the hall. At 34, Sarah had been teaching for 8 years, but her tenure at Riverside Elementary was relatively new. 2 years ago, when her marriage to Tom Wilson had finally crumbled under the weight of his gambling addiction and her discovery of his mounting debts, she had made the difficult decision to start fresh in Cedar Falls, Oregon. The move from Portland had been both liberating and terrifying, trading the familiar chaos of her old life for the unknown possibilities of a small community where nobody knew about her failed marriage or the nights she had spent crying over credit card statements she couldn't pay. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where teachers still received handwritten thank you notes from parents, and where the local coffee shop knew your order by your second visit. With a population hovering around 45,000, it was large, enough to offer decent amenities, but small enough that Sarah could walk to work on pleasant days, enjoying the tree-lined streets and the view of the Cascade Mountains in the distance. The town had a diverse population, with a significant Latino community that had grown over the past decade as families moved north seeking better opportunities in the agricultural and light manufacturing sectors that formed the backbone of the local economy. Riverside Elementary reflected this diversity, serving children from families who ranged from established middle-class professionals to recent immigrants working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Sarah had quickly learned that effective teaching here required not just academic skills, but cultural sensitivity and an understanding of the economic pressures that many of her students' families faced. Some children arrived at school having had a full breakfast and help with their homework, while others came hungry and tired, their parents already at work before dawn. Sarah's own apartment in the Pinewood Gardens complex was a modest one-bedroom unit that she had furnished with a combination of items from her previous life and pieces acquired from local thrift stores. The space was functional rather than beautiful, with white walls that she had brightened with student artwork and photographs from hiking trips she had taken alone to explore her new surroundings. Her ex-husband, Tom, had kept most of their furniture in the divorce settlement, claiming it as compensation for what he called her unreasonable demands regarding his gambling debts. Sarah had been too exhausted by the legal process to fight. Him, instead, choosing to view her sparse living situation as an opportunity for a minimalist fresh start. The 20-minute drive from her apartment to Riverside Elementary had become a cherished part of her daily routine. She would leave early, stop at Brewster's Coffee for a large dark roast, and use the commute to mentally prepare for the day ahead. Her route took her through different neighborhoods, from the newer developments near her apartment complex to the older, more economically diverse areas surrounding the school. She had grown to appreciate how this transition served as a daily reminder of the different worlds her students inhabited and the various challenges they brought with them into her classroom. Room 15 had become Sarah's sanctuary over the past 2 years. She had spent countless hours after school arranging and rearranging the furniture, creating learning centers that encouraged collaboration, and filling the space with books that reflected the cultural backgrounds of her students. The walls displayed student work alongside motivational posters in both English and Spanish, and she had learned enough basic Spanish to communicate with families who were more comfortable in their native language. The classroom library included books by Latino authors and stories that featured characters who looked like her students, something she had realized was often missing from traditional curriculum materials. Sarah's teaching philosophy centered on the belief that every child deserved to feel seen, valued, and capable of success. She had observed too many students who had been labeled as problematic or slow learners when they were actually dealing with circumstances beyond their control. Hunger, unstable housing, language barriers, and family stress could all manifest as behavioral or academic issues in the classroom, and Sarah had trained herself to look beyond surface behaviors to understand what her students might really need. This approach had sometimes put her at odds with the school's administration, particularly Principal Janet Henderson, who favored strict adherence to district policies and procedures. Henderson was a veteran educator in her late 50s who had risen through the ranks during an era when teaching was more about maintaining order and delivering standardized instruction. She viewed Sarah's more individualized approach with suspicion, often reminding her that good intentions could not substitute for proper documentation and following established protocols. Despite these philosophical differences, Sarah had found her place at Riverside Elementary. Her students consistently showed strong academic growth, and she had developed positive relationships with most of the families in her classes. She participated in school committees, volunteered for after-school programs, and had even started learning Spanish through online courses to better communicate with parents who were not fluent in English. The work was demanding and often emotionally draining, but it provided Sarah with a sense of purpose that had been missing during the final years of her marriage. Her personal life remained largely solitary, which was partly by choice and partly by circumstance. Dating in a small town as a recently divorced teacher required a level of social navigation that Sarah was not yet ready to attempt. She had formed a friendship with Mark Chen, a retired firefighter who lived in the apartment next to hers and who often helped her with practical tasks like moving furniture or fixing her temperamental air conditioning unit. Their relationship was comfortable and uncomplicated, built around shared morning runs and occasional dinners where they discussed everything from local politics to their favorite Netflix series. Mark had become something of a confidant for Sarah, listening patiently as she processed the challenges of her new life and offering practical advice drawn from his years of emergency response work. He had an intuitive understanding of the emotional toll that helping others could take, and he often reminded Sarah of the importance of maintaining boundaries and taking care of herself. Their friendship had evolved naturally without the pressure or complications that Sarah associated with romantic relationships, and she valued having someone in her life who understood her dedication to her work without trying to change or limit it. The school year had begun with its usual mixture of excitement and anxiety as Sarah met her new class and began the process of learning each child's individual needs, strengths, and challenges. September in Cedar Falls was particularly beautiful, with warm days and cool evenings that made the return to school feel like a fresh beginning rather than the end of summer freedom. The students seemed energetic and eager, and Sarah had been optimistic about the potential for a successful year. Among her 23 students, several had already caught her attention for various reasons. There was Marcus, whose enthusiasm for reading was matched only by his difficulty sitting still for more than 5 minutes at a time. Angela showed remarkable artistic talent, but struggled with math concepts that seemed to frustrate her to tears. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David was clearly intellectually gifted, but appeared to be deliberately underperforming, perhaps to avoid standing out among his peers. And then there was Maya Rodriguez, a quiet 8-year-old with intelligent dark eyes and a serious demeanor that seemed unusual for her age. Maya was one of Sarah's strongest students academically, consistently completing assignments with care and precision, but she rarely spoke during class discussions and seemed to carry herself with a weight that concerned Sarah. During the first weeks of school, Sarah had noticed that Maya often looked tired, occasionally falling asleep during reading time, and she seemed to take on a protective role with younger students during recess that suggested she was accustomed to caring for others. Maya's family situation was somewhat unclear to Sarah, as the emergency contact forms listed only her father, Carlos Rodriguez, with a work number that went straight to voicemail when Sarah had tried to call during the first week of school to introduce herself. The forms indicated that Maya lived with her father and younger sister, but provided no information about her mother or other family members. Sarah had made a mental note to reach out again and perhaps arrange a conference to get to know the family better, but the busy pace of the new school year had prevented her from following up as quickly as she had intended. The morning routine in room 15 followed a predictable pattern that Sarah had refined over her years of teaching. Students arrived between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, hanging their backpacks on designated hooks and completing morning work that reviewed previously, learned concepts while Sarah took attendance and prepared for the day's lessons. The classroom hummed with quiet activity as children sharpened pencils, organized their supplies, and chatted softly with friends about their evening activities or weekend plans. Sarah moved through the room during this time, greeting each student individually and making mental notes about their energy levels, moods, and any concerns they might share. This informal assessment period had proven invaluable for identifying students who might need extra support or attention during the day, whether due to academic struggles, social conflicts, or problems at home. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a child was having difficulties, and she prided herself on creating an environment where students felt safe enough to seek help when they needed it. The diversity of her classroom was reflected not just in the variety of cultural backgrounds represented, but also in the wide range of economic circumstances that shaped her students' daily experiences. Some children arrived with elaborate lunchboxes packed with organic snacks and name-brand items, while others qualified for free breakfast and lunch programs, and sometimes asked if they could take home leftover fruit from the classroom snack supply. Sarah had learned to navigate these differences sensitively, ensuring that all students felt valued regardless of their family's financial situation. This awareness had led her to keep a discretionary supply of school materials, snacks, and even clean clothes in her classroom closet, funded largely through her own budget and occasional donations from families who had extra resources to share. She had discovered that a child's ability to focus and learn could be significantly impacted by basic needs like hunger, clean clothing, or having the proper supplies for assignments, and she was willing to quietly address these issues without drawing attention to individual students' circumstances. The first period of each day was dedicated to mathematics, and Sarah had arranged the classroom to facilitate both individual work and collaborative learning. Students could choose to work at their assigned desks, gather in the carpeted area near the whiteboard, or use the standing tables near the windows if they needed to move around while thinking. This flexibility accommodated different learning styles and helped students develop self-awareness about their own needs and preferences. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, Sarah was introducing a unit on measurement that would incorporate both standard and metric units. She had planned hands-on activities that would allow students to measure objects around the classroom and compare their findings, building both mathematical understanding and practical skills. The lesson plan also included opportunities for students to work in pairs, which would help develop their communication and collaboration abilities while reinforcing the academic content. As students settled into their morning routine, Sarah noticed that Maya appeared more subdued than usual. The girl had arrived on time and completed her morning work, but she seemed to be moving more slowly than normal and kept glancing around the room with an expression that Sarah could not quite interpret. When Sarah approached Maya's desk to check her morning work, she observed that the child's handwriting, usually neat and careful, appeared somewhat shaky, and there were several erasure marks on problems that Maya typically completed easily. Sarah made a mental note to keep an eye on Maya throughout the morning, wondering if the child might be feeling unwell or dealing with some kind of stress at home. In her experience, changes in a student's typical behavior patterns often indicated that something significant was happening in their life, and early intervention could sometimes prevent small problems from becoming larger ones. She resolved to find an opportunity to speak with Maya privately during the day to see if there was anything she needed or wanted to discuss. The mathematics lesson proceeded smoothly, with most students engaged in measuring various objects around the classroom using rulers and measuring tapes. Sarah circulated among the groups, asking questions that encouraged critical thinking and helping students who were struggling with the concepts or the tools. The activity generated a pleasant buzz of conversation as children compared their measurements and debated whose technique was more accurate. It was during this active learning time, as Sarah was helping a group of students measure the height of the bookshelf near the windows, that she first noticed Maya's unusual behavior. Instead of participating in the measuring activity with her assigned partner, Maya was sitting at her desk, fumbling with something in her hands underneath the desktop. Sarah's teacher instincts, honed by years of experience with children who tried to hide inappropriate items during class time, immediately picked up on the furtive nature of Maya's movements. Sarah excused herself from the group she was helping and moved casually toward Maya's desk, expecting to find the usual contraband of small toys, candy, or perhaps a note being passed between friends. As she approached, Maya quickly tried to stuff whatever she was holding into her desk, but her nervous movements caused the object to slip from her hands and fall to the floor with a soft, rattling sound that caught Sarah's attention immediately. What Sarah saw when she looked down made her heart skip a beat and her professional training kick into high gear. Scattered across the floor beside Maya's desk were several pills in different colors, shapes, and sizes, along with what appeared to be crushed fragments of additional medication. A small plastic bag, the kind typically used for sandwiches, lay open nearby, and Sarah could see that it contained more pills of various descriptions. The sight was so unexpected and concerning that Sarah had to consciously maintain her calm exterior while her mind raced through the immediate safety protocols she needed to follow. Her first instinct was to protect Maya from embarrassment while ensuring the safety of all the students in the classroom. But she also knew that she was looking at a situation that required immediate intervention and careful documentation. Sarah knelt down beside Maya's desk, speaking in a quiet voice that would not draw attention from the other students. "Maya, I need you to help me pick these up very carefully. don't touch them with your hands, okay? She reached for a tissue from the nearby dispenser and began gathering the pills, while Maya watched with wide, frightened eyes that seemed to hold secrets far too heavy for an 8-year-old child to carry. As Sarah collected the scattered medication, she could see that the pills included various types and dosages, some that she recognized as common over-the-counter medications, and others that appeared to be prescription drugs with markings she could not immediately identify. The combination was alarming, not just because of the potential danger to Maya and her classmates, but because it suggested a level of access to medications that was highly unusual for a child Maya's age. The weight of the moment settled on Sarah as she realized that this discovery was likely just the beginning of a much larger and more complex situation than a simple case of a child bringing inappropriate items to school. Maya's face had drained, of all color, as she watched Sarah carefully collect the scattered pills, her small hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her desk. The child's reaction told Sarah everything she needed to know about the gravity of the situation, but it also raised 1,000 questions about how an 8-year-old had come to possess such a concerning collection of medications. Sarah's mind raced through her training protocols while she maintained the calm, reassuring demeanor that years of teaching had taught her to project even in crisis situations. "Maya, sweetheart, I need you to stay very calm for me," Sarah whispered, ensuring. Her voice carried only warmth and concern rather than alarm. "Can you tell me where these came from?" The question was gentle but direct, and Sarah watched carefully as Maya's eyes filled with tears that she was clearly trying hard not to shed. The child's silence spoke volumes about the complexity of whatever situation had led to this moment. Around them, the other students continued their measurement activities, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding at Maya's desk. Sarah was grateful for the natural noise and movement of the hands-on lesson, which provided cover for her quiet conversation with Maya. She could hear Marcus announcing loudly that the pencil sharpener was exactly 4 3/4 inches tall, while Angela was debating with her partner about whether they should round their measurements to the nearest half-inch. Sarah finished collecting the pills and fragments, carefully placing them in the tissue without touching them directly. Her emergency response training from her teaching certification had covered situations involving dangerous substances, and she knew that preserving evidence while protecting everyone's safety was crucial. The plastic bag that had contained the pills was now empty, except for a few crumbs of what appeared to be crushed medication. And Sarah could see that Maya had been handling these substances with her bare hands. "Maya, I need you to come with me to wash your hands very thoroughly," Sarah said, helping the child stand on shaky legs. "We're going to go to the sink in the back of the room, and then we need to have a talk." Sarah caught the attention of Angela, one of her most responsible students, and asked her to help supervise the measurement activity while she stepped away for a few minutes. As they moved toward the classroom sink, Sarah noticed that Maya was walking with unusual care, as though each step required conscious effort. The child's normally perfect posture had given way to a slight slumping of her shoulders, and Sarah wondered if Maya might be feeling the effects of whatever medications she had been exposed to. The possibility that the child had ingested any of the pills sent a chill through Sarah's chest, and she realized that this situation might require immediate medical attention. At the sink, Sarah guided Maya through washing her hands with soap and warm water, taking care to ensure that every trace of medication residue was removed from the child's fingers and palms. Maya submitted to this process without protest, but her continued silence and the fearful glances she kept shooting towards Sarah suggested that she was terrified of the consequences of her discovery. "Maya, I'm not angry with you," Sarah said, as she helped the child dry her hands with paper towels. "But I am worried about you, and I need to understand what's happening so I can help. Can you tell me if you took any of these pills?" The question was crucial, and Sarah watched Maya's face carefully for any sign that would indicate whether this was a potential poisoning situation requiring immediate emergency intervention. Maya shook her head quickly, but then paused and looked up at Sarah with confusion clouding her dark eyes. "I don't think so," she whispered, her voice so quiet that Sarah had to lean down to hear her clearly. "But Abuela said they would help her feel better, and I thought maybe if I brought them to school, someone could help me understand which ones were the right ones to give her." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Maya wasn't bringing drugs to school for any malicious purpose or even out of curiosity about medications. She was trying to help someone she loved, someone who was apparently sick enough to need multiple medications, and she had turned to school as a place where adults might have answers to questions she couldn't solve on her own. "Who is Abuela, Maya?" Sarah asked gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Abuela was Spanish for grandmother, and Sarah's heart ached as she began to understand the weight of responsibility that this 8-year-old child had been carrying. "She's my daddy's mama," Maya replied, tears finally beginning to spill down her cheeks. "She came to live with us when she got sick, but she forgets things sometimes. She forgets which medicine to take and when to take it, and yesterday she took too many of the white ones and couldn't wake up for a long time. I was scared, and Daddy was at work, and I didn't know what to do." Sarah felt her professional training warring with her maternal instincts as she processed Maya's explanation. The child was describing a potentially dangerous medication management situation involving an elderly family member with what sounded like cognitive impairment, possibly dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The fact that Maya had taken on the responsibility of trying to sort out her grandmother's medications spoke to both the child's maturity and the desperate circumstances her family was facing. "Maya, you did exactly the right thing by bringing these to me," Sarah said, pulling a chair close to the sink so they could sit at eye level with each other. "Taking care of someone you love is very important, but these medicines are too complicated for children to handle safely. They need to be managed by doctors and other adults who understand how they work." Maya nodded, wiping her nose with the tissue Sarah offered her. "I know they're not for kids," she said, "but Abuela gets confused, and sometimes she can't remember if she already took her medicine, so she takes more, and sometimes she forgets to take it at all, and then she feels really bad. Daddy works so much that he's not home very much, and Sophia is too little to help." The picture Maya was painting became clearer with each detail she shared. Carlos Rodriguez was apparently working multiple jobs to support his family, which now included his elderly mother, who required significant medical care and supervision. Maya, as the older child, had naturally taken on caregiving responsibilities that were far beyond what any 8-year-old should be expected to handle. The stress of this situation was undoubtedly affecting her academic performance and emotional well-being, even if she had been too mature and responsible to complain about it. Sarah realized that she was facing a situation that went far beyond the immediate safety concern of medications in the classroom. This was a family in crisis, struggling with the complex challenges of caring for an elderly relative with cognitive decline while managing work obligations and the needs of young children. The fact that Maya had brought the medications to school suggested that the family's current support systems were inadequate and that they might not have access to the resources they needed to manage the grandmother's care safely. "Maya, I need to ask you some important questions, and I want you to tell me the truth, okay?" Sarah said, taking the child's small hands in her own. "Has Abuela ever taken the wrong medicines before? Have there been other times when she couldn't wake up or when she seemed confused about her medications?" Maya nodded slowly, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. "It happens a lot," she admitted, Sometimes she takes pills that aren't hers, and sometimes she takes too many of the same ones. Last week, she took some of Daddy's medicine for his back pain, and it made her sick to her stomach. I try to watch her, but I can't be with her all the time, and I don't always know which ones are right. The implications of Maya's revelation sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's mind. An elderly person with cognitive impairment having unsupervised access to multiple medications was a recipe for accidental overdose, dangerous drug interactions, or other serious medical complications. The fact that the grandmother was apparently taking medications prescribed for other family members made the situation even more dangerous. Sarah also recognized that Maya was carrying an enormous emotional burden for such a young child. The fear and anxiety evident in her voice when she described trying to monitor her grandmother's medication use suggested that she was living in a constant state of worry about her family members' safety and well-being. This level of stress could certainly explain the changes in Maya's behavior and academic performance that Sarah had noticed over the past few weeks. Maya, you have been very brave and very smart to try to help your grandmother, Sarah said carefully. But this is a problem that needs help from adults who know about medicines and taking care of older people who are sick. I'm going to need to call some people who can help your family, okay? The fear that flashed across Maya's face was immediate and intense. Are you going to call the police? She whispered. Are they going to arrest Daddy for not taking good enough care of Abuela? He tries really hard, but he has to work so much, and we don't have enough money for someone to stay with her during the day. Sarah's heart broke at the child's obvious terror that her attempt to seek help might result in her father getting into trouble. Maya's reaction also revealed important information about the family's financial situation and their apparent lack of access to professional caregiving services. The fear that Carlos might be held legally responsible for his mother's medication management issues suggested that the family was already feeling overwhelmed and isolated in their caregiving responsibilities. No one is going to arrest your Daddy, Sarah assured Maya firmly. What I'm going to do is call people whose job it is to help families take care of sick relatives. There are nurses and social workers who know how to make sure that Abuela gets the right medicines at the right times, and they can teach your family how to keep everyone safe. Maya seemed to relax slightly at this explanation, but Sarah could see that the child was still deeply worried about the consequences of her disclosure. Will they make Abuela go away? Maya asked in a small voice. She doesn't have anywhere else to live, and Daddy says we have to take care of family. The question revealed another layer of complexity to the Rodriguez family's situation. Sarah suspected that cultural values about family responsibility were playing a significant role in how the family was approaching the grandmother's care. Many Latino families felt a strong obligation to care for elderly relatives at home rather than seeking institutional care, even when the demands of that care exceeded their resources and capabilities. The people I'm going to call want to help families stay together, Sarah explained. Their job is to find ways to make sure everyone is safe and healthy while keeping the family together. They might be able to arrange for a nurse to visit your house or help your daddy learn how to organize Abuela's medicines so she doesn't get confused about them. As Sarah spoke with Maya, she was simultaneously running through the protocols she needed to follow for this type of situation. Her first priority was ensuring Maya's immediate safety and determining whether the child had been exposed to any dangerous medications. Her second priority was connecting the Rodriguez family with appropriate medical and social services to address the grandmother's care needs before a more serious incident occurred. Sarah also recognized that she was dealing with a situation that involved potential cultural and language barriers. Her limited Spanish skills would probably not be adequate for the complex conversations that would need to take place with Carlos Rodriguez about his mother's care, and she would need to ensure that translation services were available for any official interactions with medical professionals or social workers. The immediate question was whether this situation required emergency intervention or whether it could be addressed through less urgent channels. Maya's description of her grandmother being unable to wake up after taking too many medications suggested that there had already been at least one potentially dangerous incident, and the ongoing pattern of medication confusion created a high risk for future problems. Sarah made the decision that this situation required immediate professional assessment. The combination of an elderly person with cognitive impairment having unsupervised access to medications, a pattern of medication errors, and young children being placed in the position of monitoring an adult's medical care created too many safety risks to address through routine referral processes. "Maya, I need to make some phone calls to get help for your family," Sarah said, standing up and gently guiding the child back toward her desk. "While I'm doing that, I want you to try to focus on the math lesson, okay? And I want you to remember that you did the right thing by bringing these medicines to me. You were trying to help someone you love, and that shows what a caring person you are." Maya nodded and returned to her seat, though Sarah could see that the child was still deeply anxious about what would happen next. Sarah made a mental note to check in with Maya frequently throughout the day to monitor her emotional state and to ensure that she didn't try to leave school early out of worry about her grandmother. As Sarah moved toward her desk to begin making the necessary phone calls, she was struck by the complexity of the situation she was about to set in motion. What had started as a routine day of teaching third-grade mathematics had suddenly become a crisis intervention involving medication safety, elder care, cultural sensitivity, and family preservation. The decision she made in the next few minutes would have significant consequences for the Rodriguez family, and she felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. Sarah pulled out her emergency contact list and began reviewing her options for getting immediate help for the Rodriguez family. Her first call would need to be to the school nurse to assess whether Maya needed medical evaluation, but she also needed to contact Child Protective Services to report the unsafe medication situation and potentially Adult Protective Services to address the grandmother's care needs. As she reached for the phone, Sarah found herself thinking about the courage it had taken for Maya to bring those medications to school. The child had recognized that her family needed help beyond what she could provide, and she had trusted school to be a safe place where adults would know how to respond appropriately. Sarah was determined to prove that Maya's trust had been well placed by ensuring that the response to this crisis strengthened rather than damaged the Rodriguez family. Following the trail, the school nurse's office at Riverside Elementary occupied a small space near the main entrance, equipped with 2 cots, a medication refrigerator, and the basic supplies needed to handle the routine injuries and illnesses that affected elementary school children. Janet Morrison had been the school nurse for 15 years, and her calm, efficient manner had earned her the trust of both students and staff. When Sarah appeared at her door with Maya in tow and a tissue full of pills in her hand, Janet immediately shifted into emergency response mode. "I need you to take a look at these," Sarah said without preamble, setting the tissue carefully on Janet's desk. "Maya brought them to school, and I need to know if she might have been exposed to anything dangerous." Sarah quickly explained the circumstances of her discovery while Janet examined the pills with a magnifying glass, making notes about their colors, shapes, and any visible markings. Janet's expression grew increasingly serious as she catalogued the medications. "This is a concerning mix," she said, looking up at Sarah with professional alarm. I can identify several of these as prescription medications that could be dangerous in the wrong doses or combinations. This one looks like a blood pressure medication, and this appears to be a diabetes drug. If an elderly person with cognitive issues has been mixing these up or taking incorrect doses, we could be looking at a medical emergency. Maya sat quietly on one of the cots while the adults discussed the medications, but Sarah could see that the child was listening intently to every word. Janet approached Maya with the gentle manner she used with all frightened students, kneeling down to speak with her at eye level. "Maya, I need to ask you some questions about these medicines," Janet said softly. "Did you touch them with your hands? Did you put any of them in your mouth?" Maya shook her head to both questions, and Janet continued her assessment by checking the child's pupils, pulse, and general alertness. After a thorough examination, Janet determined that Maya showed no signs of medication exposure or poisoning. "She seems fine physically," Janet told Sarah privately while Maya used the restroom. "But this situation with the grandmother needs immediate attention. If these medications belong to an elderly person who is confusing doses and combinations, she could be in serious danger." We're also looking at a child welfare issue, since Maya has obviously been placed in the position of trying to manage an adult's medical care. Sarah nodded, having reached the same conclusions during her conversation with Maya. "I need to contact CPS and probably Adult Protective Services as well," she said. "But I also want to make sure I'm not making this situation worse for the family. Maya is terrified that her father will get in trouble, and I got the impression that they don't have many resources for getting professional help with the grandmother's care." Janet agreed that the situation required careful handling. "The good news is that Maya came to you for help, which suggests that the family wants to do the right thing but doesn't know how. This isn't a case of neglect or abuse. It's a case of a family being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. The response should be focused on providing support and resources rather than punishment." With Janet's assessment complete, Sarah returned to her classroom to find her students still engaged in their measurement activities, supervised by Angela, who had taken her temporary leadership role very seriously. Sarah quietly thanked Angela for her help and resumed teaching, but her mind remained focused on the phone calls she needed to make during her lunch break. Maya had returned to her seat and was attempting to participate in the lesson, but Sarah could see that the child was distracted and worried. Sarah made several opportunities throughout the morning to check in with Maya, offering quiet reassurance that help was coming and that no one was angry with her for bringing the medications to school. During recess, Sarah remained in her classroom to begin making the necessary phone calls. Her first call was to the Child Protective Services hotline, where she spoke with an intake worker named David Kim, who specialized in cases involving cultural and language considerations. Sarah explained the situation in detail, emphasizing that this appeared to be a family seeking help rather than a case requiring punitive intervention. David listened carefully to Sarah's account and asked several clarifying questions about the family's circumstances and Maya's demeanor during their conversation. "This sounds like a case where we need to coordinate with Adult Protective Services and probably some medical professionals," he said. "The immediate concern is the grandmother's medication safety, but we also need to assess whether the family has access to appropriate support services." Sarah was relieved by David's thoughtful approach to the situation. "Maya mentioned that her father works multiple jobs and that they don't have much money," she said. "I get the impression that they want to care for the grandmother at home, but don't have the resources to do it safely. That's a common situation in families dealing with elder care," David replied. "There are programs that can help with medication management, respite care, and other support services, but many families don't know how to access them." I'm going to arrange for a bilingual social worker to contact the family today to begin an assessment and connect them with appropriate resources. Sarah's second call was to Adult Protective Services, where she spoke with Maria Santos, a social worker who specialized in cases involving elderly individuals with cognitive impairments. Maria was particularly interested in Sarah's description of the medication confusion and the incident where the grandmother had been unable to wake up after taking too many pills. That type of incident suggests that she's at high risk for accidental overdose, Maria explained. We need to get someone out to assess her living situation and medication management needs as soon as possible. The fact that young children are being asked to monitor her medication use is also concerning from a child welfare perspective. Maria assured Sarah that her department would coordinate with CPS to ensure that both the grandmother's needs and the children's welfare were addressed comprehensively. Our goal is always to help families stay together safely, she said. There are often solutions that don't require removing anyone from the home, but they do require connecting families with appropriate professional support. Sarah's third call was to Principal Henderson, who needed to be informed about any situation involving potential child endangerment or emergency services contact. Henderson listened to Sarah's report with her characteristic attention to procedural details, asking several questions about documentation and timeline. You followed appropriate protocols, Henderson said when Sarah finished her account. The immediate safety assessment was correct, and involving the school nurse was the right first step. Make sure you document everything thoroughly and keep me informed about any follow-up contacts from social services. Sarah appreciated Henderson's straightforward response, though she detected a hint of concern in the principal's tone that suggested she was already thinking about potential complications or publicity that might arise from the situation. Henderson had always been focused on protecting the school's reputation and ensuring that staff actions could be defended if questioned by parents or district administration. After completing her phone calls, Sarah spent the remainder of her lunch break researching resources for families dealing with elder care challenges. She discovered that Cedar Falls had a senior services center that offered medication management programs, respite care, and other support services, but many of their programs required insurance coverage or private payment that might be beyond the Rodriguez family's means. She also found information about a Latino community organization that provided translation services and advocacy for families navigating social service systems. Sarah made a note to share this information with the social workers who would be contacting the family, thinking that having culturally appropriate support might help Carlos Rodriguez feel more comfortable seeking help. When students returned from recess, Sarah noticed that Maya seemed even more anxious than she had been earlier in the day. The child kept glancing toward the classroom door as though expecting someone to arrive, and she was having difficulty focusing on the afternoon lessons. Sarah decided to speak with Maya privately again to provide reassurance about what would happen next. Maya, I want you to know that the people I called are going to contact your daddy today, Sarah said during a quiet moment while other students were working independently. They're not going to be angry with him, and they're not going to take anyone away from your family. They just want to help make sure that Abuela gets the right medicines and that everyone stays safe. Maya nodded, but Sarah could see that the child was still deeply worried. What if Daddy gets mad at me for telling you about Abuela? Maya asked. He always says that family business should stay in the family, and maybe he didn't want other people to know that she's sick. Sarah recognized the cultural dimension of Maya's concern. Many families, particularly those from traditional backgrounds, felt that accepting outside help was a sign of failure or weakness. Carlos Rodriguez might indeed be upset that his daughter had shared private family information with school personnel, even if that sharing ultimately led to helpful resources. Maya, when people love each other the way your family does, sometimes asking for help is the best way to take care of each other, Sarah explained. Your daddy works very hard to take care of you and Sofia and Abuela, but taking care of someone who is sick with medicines is a job that requires special training. Getting help from people who know about medicines doesn't mean your daddy isn't doing a good job. It just means he's being smart about keeping everyone safe. This explanation seemed to help Maya relax slightly, and she was able to participate more effectively in the afternoon lessons. Sarah continued to monitor the child's emotional state throughout the day, offering quiet encouragement and maintaining the kind of normal classroom routine that she knew would be comforting to a child. Dealing with family stress. As the school day neared its end, Sarah began to wonder about the logistics of Maya's after-school care. If Carlos Rodriguez was working multiple jobs, who would be with Maya and her sister when they got home? Would they be returning to a house where an elderly woman with medication confusion was unsupervised? Sarah realized that she might need to delay Maya's dismissal until she could confirm that appropriate arrangements had been made for the children's safety. At 3:15, as students were packing their backpacks and preparing for dismissal, Sarah noticed a man approaching her classroom door. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with the weathered hands and tanned skin of someone who worked outdoors, and his expression combined exhaustion with deep concern. Sarah suspected immediately that this was Carlos Rodriguez, and her assumption was confirmed when Maya looked up and called out, "Daddy!" with obvious relief. Carlos entered the classroom hesitantly, his eyes moving from Maya to Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude with apprehension. Sarah could see that he was trying to assess the situation and determine whether his daughter was in trouble or whether this meeting would result in negative consequences for his family. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah said, approaching him with her hand, extended in greeting. "I'm Maya's teacher, Sarah Mitchell. Thank you for coming so quickly." She switched to her limited Spanish to add, "Mucho gusto," hoping to convey respect for his cultural background. Carlos shook her hand, his grip firm but brief. "The lady from social services. She called me at work," he said in accented but clear English. "She said Maya brought medicines to school. I came as soon as I could get away." His voice carried the weight of someone who was used to dealing with crises, but was never quite sure what new challenge each day might bring. Sarah gestured toward two student desks that she had arranged for their conversation, noting that Carlos's hands were shaking slightly as he sat down. She suspected that he had been terrified during the drive from work to school, imagining the worst possible scenarios for why his daughter's teacher needed to speak with him about medications. "Mr. Rodriguez, Maya is not in any trouble," Sarah began, wanting to address his most immediate concern. "She brought some pills to school because she was worried about her mother, your mother, and she was hoping that someone here could help her understand how to take care of her grandmother properly." The relief that washed over Carlos's face was visible, followed immediately by a complex mixture of pride in his daughter's caring nature and shame that his family's private struggles had become known to outsiders. Sarah watched him struggle with these conflicting emotions while Maya moved to stand beside his chair, reaching for his hand with the unconscious gesture of a child who was used to providing comfort to adults. "My mother. She is very sick," Carlos said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Her mind, it is not working the same as before. She forgets things, gets confused about her medicines. I try to help her, but I work during the day and at night. And Maya, she tries to help too, but she is just a little girl." Sarah felt her heart ache for this man who was clearly drowning in responsibilities that exceeded his resources. "Maya, told me that your mother sometimes takes the wrong medicines or takes too many," she said gently. "She was scared because yesterday your mother couldn't wake up after taking too many pills." Carlos closed his eyes briefly, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten with the effort of maintaining his composure. "I found her like that when I came home from work," he admitted. "I was so scared, but she woke up after a while, and I thought maybe she was just very tired. I didn't know that Maya had seen it happen." The admission revealed the full scope of the crisis the Rodriguez family had been facing. Carlos was working multiple jobs to support his family and pay for his mother's medical care, leaving Maya to serve as a caregiver for her grandmother during critical hours when medication errors were most likely to occur. The incident, where the grandmother had been unresponsive after taking too many medications, could easily have resulted in a medical emergency requiring hospitalization or worse. "Mr. Rodriguez, Maya was very brave to bring those medicines to me," Sarah said. "She knew that the situation was too complicated for her to handle alone, and she was looking for help from adults who might know more about medicines than she does. She loves your mother very much, and she wants to make sure that she stays safe and healthy." Carlos looked down at Maya with an expression of love mixed with sorrow that his young daughter had been burdened with such adult concerns. "She has always been very responsible," he said quietly. "Maybe too responsible for a little girl. Since her mama died, she thinks she has to take care of everyone." The reference to Maya's mother's death added another layer of complexity to the family's situation. Sarah realized that Maya had already experienced significant loss and was probably terrified of losing her grandmother as well. The child's attempt to manage her grandmother's medications was likely motivated not just by love, but by fear of another devastating loss that she felt powerless to prevent. "The social workers who called you today want to help your family find ways to keep your mother safe while keeping everyone together at home," Sarah explained. "There are programs that can help with medication management, and there might be ways to get some assistance with care during the day when you're at work." Carlos nodded slowly, though Sarah could see that he remained skeptical about accepting help from government agencies. "I will listen to what they have to say," he said carefully, "but I take care of my family. That is my responsibility." Sarah understood the cultural and personal pride that made accepting help difficult for Carlos, but she also knew that the current situation was unsustainable and potentially dangerous. "Taking care of your family includes making sure they have access to the best possible help when they need it," she said gently. "Getting professional assistance with your mother's medication management doesn't mean you're not taking good care of her. It means you're being smart about keeping her safe." As their conversation continued, Sarah found herself deeply impressed by Carlos's obvious devotion to his family and his determination to provide for them despite overwhelming challenges. She also gained a fuller understanding of the circumstances that had led Maya to bring medications to school, recognizing the child's action as a desperate attempt to find solutions to problems that were beyond her ability to solve. The meeting with Carlos reinforced Sarah's belief that this was a family in crisis who needed support rather than punishment. The love and commitment that bound the Rodriguez family together was evident, but they lacked the resources and knowledge necessary to manage the complex medical needs of an elderly family member with cognitive impairment. Sarah was hopeful that the intervention she had initiated would lead to appropriate services that would strengthen rather than disrupt the family unit. The shocking discovery. The following morning brought an unexpected phone call that would reveal the true complexity of the Rodriguez family's situation. Sarah was preparing for another day of teaching when her cell phone rang at 6:30, displaying a number she didn't recognize. The caller identified herself as Dr. Amanda Clark from the emergency department at Cedar Falls General Hospital, and her words immediately sent Sarah's heart racing. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling about the Rodriguez family," Dr. Clark said without preamble. "Maya's grandmother was brought in by ambulance early this morning after her son found her unconscious at home. We understand that you were the person who initiated the social services contact yesterday regarding medication concerns." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed this news. Despite all the phone calls and interventions from the previous day, Isabella Rodriguez had suffered exactly the kind of medical emergency that everyone had been trying to prevent. "Is she going to be okay?" Sarah asked, already dreading the answer. "She's stable now, but it was touch and go for several hours," Dr. Clark replied grimly. "She appears to have taken a significant overdose of multiple medications, including some that were prescribed for other family members. Her blood work shows dangerously high levels of diabetes medication, blood pressure drugs, and cardiac medications. If her son hadn't found her when he did, we might be having a very different conversation." The implications of this news hit Sarah like a physical blow. While she had been feeling proud of her quick response to Maya's cry for help, Isabella Rodriguez had been at home, taking the very medication combinations that everyone had identified as dangerous. The timing suggested that the stress of outside intervention might have actually made the situation worse, perhaps causing confusion or anxiety that led to the overdose. "How are the children?" Sarah asked, thinking immediately of Maya and Sophia, who would have to deal with the trauma of seeing their grandmother taken away in an ambulance. "That's one of the reasons I'm calling," Dr. Clark said. "Carlos Rodriguez is here at the hospital with his mother, and the children are currently with a neighbor. But the social workers are concerned about the living situation, and there may need to be temporary arrangements made for the children's care while we sort out the grandmother's medical needs and long-term care plan." Sarah felt a familiar sense of responsibility stirring within her, the same instinct that had driven her to follow Maya into the woods behind the school in the original story, translated now into this new crisis. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she heard herself asking before she had fully considered the implications of the offer. Dr. Clark paused before responding, and Sarah could hear the sounds of a busy emergency department in the background. "Actually, there might be," she said finally. "Carlos Rodriguez has been asking about you, wanting to know if he could speak with you about what happened. I think he's trying to understand how we got from his daughter bringing pills to school to his mother nearly dying from an overdose. He seems to think that talking to you might help him make sense of the timeline." Sarah checked her watch and realized that she would need to call for a substitute teacher if she wanted to go to the hospital before school started. The decision felt significant in ways that extended beyond the immediate crisis, marking another moment where her personal involvement with the student's family was crossing professional boundaries in response to extraordinary circumstances. "I can be there in an hour," Sarah said, already mentally composing the email she would send to Principal Henderson explaining her absence. "Where should I meet him?" Dr. Clark provided directions to the family conference room where Carlos was waiting, and Sarah quickly arranged for substitute coverage before driving to Cedar Falls General Hospital. During the 20-minute drive, she found herself reliving the events of the previous day, wondering if there was something she could have done differently to prevent the crisis that had unfolded overnight. The hospital's emergency department was busier than Sarah had expected for early morning, with the controlled chaos of medical professionals responding to various crises and emergencies. She found the family conference room where Carlos Rodriguez sat alone, his work clothes rumpled and his face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent worrying about his mother's survival. When Carlos looked up, and saw Sarah entering the room. His expression crumbled with a mixture of gratitude and despair that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Miss Mitchell," he said, rising to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming. I didn't know who else to call, and the doctors, they keep asking me questions I don't know how to answer." Sarah sat down across from Carlos, noting the exhaustion in his posture and the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "How is your mother doing?" she asked gently, wanting to assess the immediate medical situation before addressing the broader implications of the crisis. "They say she will live, but it was very close," Carlos replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "They had to pump her stomach and give her medicines to reverse what she had taken. The doctor said that if I had found her even 30 minutes later, she might have died." His voice broke on the last word, and Sarah could see the weight of guilt and fear that he was carrying. "Carlos, this is not your fault," Sarah said firmly, recognizing the self-blame that was consuming him. "Your mother has a medical condition that makes it difficult for her to manage medication safely. What happened last night was an accident, not something you could have prevented by working less or being home more." Carlos shook his head, clearly unconvinced by her reassurance. "But Maya, she knew something was wrong. She tried to tell me by bringing those pills to school. If I had listened better, if I had understood what she was trying to say, maybe I could have stopped this from happening." Sarah felt her heart ache for this man who was torturing himself with what-if scenarios that served no purpose except to increase his suffering. "Maya brought those pills to school because she loves your mother and wanted to help her," Sarah explained patiently. "She wasn't trying to warn you about something specific. She was looking for adults who might know more about medicines than she did. What she did was exactly right for an 8-year-old child who recognized that a situation was too complicated for her to handle alone." As their conversation continued, Sarah began to understand the full sequence of events that had led to Isabella Rodriguez's overdose. After receiving calls from social services the previous day, Carlos had left work early to come home and talk with his mother about her medication management. The conversation had been difficult, conducted partly in Spanish and partly in English, with Isabella becoming increasingly agitated about the prospect of strangers coming into her home to manage her personal care. The stress of this conversation, combined with her existing confusion about medications, had apparently triggered the very behavior that everyone was trying to prevent. Carlos explained that his mother had become increasingly upset as the evening progressed, repeatedly asking when the government people were coming to take her away. Despite his attempts to reassure her that no one was planning to remove her from the home, Isabella had grown more agitated and suspicious. When Carlos left the house briefly to pick up Sofia from her after-school program, Isabella had apparently decided to take matters into her own hands. "I think she was trying to take all her medicines at once so that she would be better before anyone came to check on her," Carlos said, his voice thick with anguish. "She doesn't understand that taking more medicine doesn't make you better faster. Her mind, it doesn't work that way anymore." The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah. Isabella Rodriguez's overdose had been directly triggered by the fear and confusion created by well-intentioned efforts to help her manage her medications safely. The elderly woman's cognitive impairment had prevented her from understanding that the social services intervention was meant to support rather than threaten her, and her response had been to engage in exactly the kind of dangerous behavior that the intervention was designed to prevent. Dr. Clark entered the conference room as Carlos was explaining the events of the previous evening, carrying a tablet computer and wearing the kind of serious expression that indicated she had difficult information to share. "Mr. Rodriguez, I wanted to update you on your mother's condition. and discuss some important decisions that need to be made about her ongoing care. Carlos straightened in his chair, bracing himself for whatever news the doctor was about to deliver. Sarah started to excuse herself from what was obviously a private medical conversation, but Dr. Clark gestured for her to remain seated. Actually, Ms. Mitchell, since you were instrumental in identifying the medication safety issues, it would be helpful for you to hear this information as well. Mr. Rodriguez has given permission for you to be involved in these discussions. Dr. Clark consulted her tablet before beginning her update. Mrs. Rodriguez is medically stable, but the overdose has revealed some concerning issues about her overall health status. The blood work we've done shows that her diabetes has been poorly controlled for quite some time, probably because of inconsistent medication compliance. Her blood pressure medications have also been taken irregularly, which has put significant strain on her cardiovascular system. The doctor paused to ensure that Carlos was following her explanation before continuing. What this means is that your mother's medical needs are more complex than can be safely managed without professional oversight. She requires medication administration at specific times, regular blood glucose monitoring, and dietary management that goes beyond what family caregivers can typically provide without training and support. Carlos absorbed this information with the resigned expression of someone who had been expecting bad news. "What are you saying I need to do?" he asked quietly. "I cannot afford to put her in a nursing home, and she would be very unhappy away from her family." "I'm not necessarily recommending institutional care," Dr. Clark replied, her tone becoming more encouraging. "But we do need to put systems in place that will prevent future medication incidents and ensure that her medical conditions are properly managed. The social worker will be able to discuss specific options with you, but there are home-based services that might meet your mother's needs while allowing her to remain with your family." Sarah found herself thinking about the complexity of elder care in families with limited financial resources and cultural preferences for keeping aging relatives at home. The Rodriguez family's situation was unfortunately common, with adult children caught between the desire to honor their parents by providing personal care and the reality that modern medical management often required professional expertise that family members simply did not possess. "Mr. Rodriguez, there's another issue we need to address," Dr. Clark continued, her expression becoming more serious. "The medication overdose that brought your mother to the hospital constitutes a reportable incident that will require investigation by Adult Protective Services. This is not a punitive process, but it is mandatory when an elderly person experiences this type of medical emergency." The fear that flashed across Carlos's face was immediate and intense. "Are they going to take her away from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are they going to say that I am not a good son because I could not keep her safe?" Sarah felt her heart break for Carlos as she recognized the guilt and cultural shame that he was experiencing. In many Latino families, caring for elderly parents was considered a sacred responsibility, and the inability to provide adequate care could be seen as a personal and familial failure. The prospect of outside intervention, even when it was clearly necessary for safety reasons, carried implications that went far beyond practical considerations. The goal of APS is to ensure safety while preserving family relationships whenever possible, Dr. Clark explained patiently. They will assess your mother's living situation and care needs, but their primary objective is to develop a plan that keeps her safe while allowing her to remain with people who love her. The fact that you recognized there was a problem and sought help will work in your favor. Dr. Clark excused herself to check on other patients, leaving Sarah and Carlos alone to process the information they had received. Carlos sat in silence for several minutes, staring at his hands, while Sarah waited for him to indicate whether he wanted to talk or needed time to think privately. "My wife. She would know what to do," Carlos said finally, his voice heavy with grief. "Elena was good with medicines, good with taking care of people. When she was alive, my mother was never confused about her pills because Elena would sit with her every morning and every evening, making sure she took the right ones at the right time." The mention of his deceased wife added another dimension to Sarah's understanding of the Rodriguez family's struggles. Carlos was not only dealing with the challenges of caring for an elderly parent with cognitive decline, but he was doing so while grieving the loss of the person who had previously managed the family's medical needs. The responsibility had fallen to him by default, but without the knowledge or experience that Eleanor had apparently possessed. "How long ago did your wife pass away?" Sarah asked gently, recognizing that this information was crucial to understanding the timeline of the family's current crisis. 2 years in December, Carlos replied, fresh pain evident in his voice. "Cancer. She fought for 8 months, but in the end, it was too strong. My mother came to live with us during Elena's illness to help with the girls and to be close to family. But then, Elena died, and I didn't know how to ask my mother to leave when she had already given up her own apartment to help us." The picture Carlos painted revealed the complexity of family obligations and changing circumstances that had led to their current situation. Isabella Rodriguez had initially moved in as a helper during her daughter-in-law's illness, but had remained as someone who needed help herself. The role reversal had apparently happened gradually, as Isabella's cognitive decline coincided with Elena's death and the family's adjustment to life without their primary caregiver. "Carlos, you have been trying to do the job of 3 people, Sarah observed compassionately. "You're working to support your family financially, caring for your mother medically, and raising 2 young daughters emotionally. No one person can sustain that level of responsibility without help, regardless of how much they love their family." Carlos nodded slowly, seeming to acknowledge the truth of Sarah's assessment, even as his cultural programming resisted the idea of admitting that he needed assistance. "I know you are right," he said quietly, "but in my family, in my culture, we take care of our own. To accept help from the government, from strangers, it feels like admitting that I have failed as a son and as a father." Sarah understood the cultural values that made accepting help difficult for Carlos, but she also recognized that his definition of taking care of family needed to be expanded to include ensuring they had access to appropriate professional services. "Carlos, if Maya was sick and needed medicine that you couldn't provide at home, you would take her to a doctor, right? You wouldn't consider that failing as a father. You would consider it being responsible for her health and safety." The analogy seemed to resonate with Carlos, and Sarah could see him processing the comparison between accepting medical help for his children and accepting care management help for his mother. "It is different when it is my mother," he said slowly. "She raised me, sacrificed for me, worked hard so that I could have opportunities. Now, when she needs me, I cannot even keep her safe from her own medicines." The anguish in Carlos's voice was heartbreaking, and Sarah found herself struggling with the professional boundaries that typically governed her interactions with students' families. The teacher in her wanted to maintain appropriate distance and refer the family to qualified social service professionals, but the human being in her was deeply moved by this man's obvious love for his family and his devastating sense of failure in caring for them. Before Sarah could respond to Carlos's expression of grief and guilt, the conference room door opened to admit a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately suggested social services. She introduced herself as Carmen Valdez, a bilingual social worker who specialized in elder care issues within Latino families. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm here to discuss options for your mother's ongoing care," Carmen said, settling into a chair across from Carlos and Sarah. "I want to start by saying that what happened to your mother last night was not your fault. Medication management for elderly individuals with cognitive decline is extremely challenging, even for trained professionals. The fact that she survived this incident gives us an opportunity to put better systems in place." Carmen's culturally sensitive approach and bilingual capabilities immediately seemed to put Carlos more at ease than he had been during previous conversations with medical professionals. When she continued the conversation in Spanish, Carlos visibly relaxed and began speaking more freely about his concerns and fears regarding his mother's care. Sarah listened to the rapid Spanish conversation without fully understanding the specific words, but she could hear the emotion in Carlos's voice and see the relief in his posture as he was finally able to express himself in his native language. Carmen occasionally translated key points for Sarah's benefit, ensuring that she remained included in the discussion despite the language barrier. Mr. Rodriguez has been explaining some of the cultural considerations that make this situation particularly challenging for his family, Carmen told Sarah during one of these translation breaks. In traditional Mexican families, placing an elderly parent in institutional care is often seen as abandonment, regardless of the practical necessities that might make such placement appropriate. We need to find solutions that honor these values while ensuring Mrs. Rodriguez's safety. Carmen outlined several options that would allow Isabella to remain living with her family while providing the professional support necessary for safe medication management. These included daily visits from a home health nurse, enrollment in an adult day program that specialized in dementia care, and participation in a medication management program that used locked dispensers and remote monitoring to prevent overdoses. The challenge, Carmen explained, is that many of these services require insurance coverage or private payment that may be beyond the family's current financial means. Mr. Rodriguez works very hard, but his income level puts the family in a difficult position where they earn too much to qualify for some assistance programs, but not enough to pay for private services. This revelation highlighted another layer of the healthcare crisis facing many American families, where middle-income earners found themselves caught between eligibility requirements for assistance programs and the financial reality of affording necessary care. Carlos's multiple jobs apparently generated enough income to disqualify the family for certain need-based programs, but not enough to comfortably pay for the professional services his mother required. Sarah found herself thinking about the practical implications of the various care options that Carmen had outlined. Even if insurance or assistance programs could be arranged to cover the costs, the logistics of coordinating multiple services while maintaining Carlos's work schedule and the children's school attendance would be enormously complex. "What about the children?" Sarah asked, bringing the conversation back to her primary area of concern. "Maya has been carrying a tremendous emotional burden, trying to help care for her grandmother. How do we ensure that she can return to being a child rather than a caregiver?" Carmen nodded approvingly at Sarah's question, clearly recognizing the importance of addressing the impact on the children as well as the elderly family member. "That's a crucial consideration that often gets overlooked in elder care planning," she agreed. "Maya has been placed in an inappropriate position of responsibility for an adult's medical needs, and both she and her sister need to be relieved of caregiving duties that exceed their developmental capabilities." Carlos looked uncomfortable as the conversation turned to his daughter's involvement in their grandmother's care, clearly recognizing that he had been relying on Maya in ways that were not appropriate for a child her age. "Maya, She wants to help, he said defensively. She loves her abuela very much, and when I am at work, there is no one else to watch and make sure she is safe. The love that Maya has for her grandmother is beautiful, Carmen acknowledged diplomatically. But 8-year-old children should not be responsible for monitoring an adult's medication compliance or making decisions about medical care. We need to put systems in place that allow Maya to maintain her loving relationship with her grandmother, while removing the burden of medical responsibility. As the conversation continued, Sarah began to understand the scope of changes that would be necessary to create a safe and sustainable care arrangement for the Rodriguez family. The solutions were complex and would require coordination between multiple agencies, healthcare providers, and support services. The process would also require significant adjustment on the part of all family members as they adapted to new routines and external oversight of previously private family matters. Carmen provided Carlos with information about the various programs and services that might be available, along with applications and contact information for organizations that could assist with navigating the complex system of elder care resources. She also scheduled follow-up appointments to assess the family's progress and ensure that appropriate services were being implemented effectively. Mr. Rodriguez, I want to emphasize that seeking help for your mother's care demonstrates strength and wisdom, not weakness or failure, Carmen said as their meeting concluded. The goal is to ensure that your mother receives the care she needs while preserving the family relationships that are clearly very important to all of you. After Carmen left to return to her other cases, Sarah and Carlos sat quietly for a few minutes, both processing the information and decisions that had been presented during their meeting. The path forward was clearer now, but it remained complicated and would require significant effort and adjustment from everyone involved. Miss Mitchell, I want to thank you for what you did yesterday, Carlos said eventually, breaking the silence that had settled between them. When Maya brought those pills to school, I was angry at first. I thought that our private business had been exposed, and I was embarrassed that people would know we were struggling. But now I understand that if you had not called for help, my mother might have died last night. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions at Carlos's gratitude, recognizing that her intervention had indeed been necessary, but also knowing that the process had been traumatic for the entire family. Maya was very brave to bring those medications. To me, she replied. She recognized that the situation was too complicated for her to handle alone, and she trusted school to be a place where adults would know how to help. I'm honored that she felt safe enough to seek help through me. Carlos smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived at the hospital, an expression that transformed his tired face and revealed the warmth and humor that his daughters undoubtedly saw in him during happier times. She has always been wise beyond her years, he said proudly. Sometimes I think she understands things better than I do, even though she is just 8 years old. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who came to inform Carlos that his mother was awake and asking for him. As he prepared to leave the conference room, Carlos hesitated at the door and turned back to Sarah with an expression of uncertainty. Miss Mitchell, would you like to meet my mother? He asked. She's been asking about the teacher who helped Maya, and I think it would mean a lot to her to thank you personally. She feels very bad that her confusion caused problems at Maya's school. Sarah found herself touched by the invitation and curious about the woman whose medical crisis had brought them all together. She followed Carlos through the emergency department to Isabella Rodriguez's bedside, noting the various monitors and IV equipment that surrounded the elderly woman as she recovered from her overdose. Isabella Rodriguez was a small, frail woman who appeared much older than her 72 years, with silver hair and dark eyes that held a sharpness that suggested her cognitive abilities were clearer at the moment than they had been the previous evening. When she saw Sarah approaching with Carlos, her face lit up with a combination of gratitude and embarrassment that was deeply moving. "Usted es la maestra de Maya," Isabella said softly, her Spanish words carrying obvious emotion. Carlos translated for Sarah, explaining that his mother was thanking her for helping Maya and apologizing for causing trouble at school. Sarah responded in her limited Spanish, telling Isabella that Maya was a wonderful student and that she was glad to help the family in any way she could. The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she listened, and she reached out to grasp Sarah's hand with surprising strength. The connection between Sarah and Isabella was immediate and profound, transcending language barriers and cultural differences through their shared concern for Maya's well-being. Isabella spoke rapidly in Spanish to Carlos, who translated her words for Sarah with obvious emotion. "She says that Maya talks about you every day, about how much she loves school and how kind you are to all the children," Carlos explained. "She says that Elena would have been grateful to know that Maya has such a good teacher, someone who pays attention and cares about what happens to her students outside of school." The mention of Elena brought fresh tears to Isabella's eyes, and Sarah could see the grief that the elderly woman still carried for her daughter-in-law's death. The loss of Elena had clearly been devastating, not just for Carlos and the children, but for Isabella as well, who had lost both a beloved family member and the person who had previously managed her medical care. As Sarah spent a few more minutes with Isabella, she began to understand the personality and character of the woman whose medication crisis had brought them all together. Despite her cognitive decline and medical fragility, Isabella possessed a dignity and warmth that explained why her family was so determined to care for her at home. She was not just a patient with complex medical needs, but a beloved family member whose presence brought joy and continuity to the Rodriguez household. The visit with Isabella reinforced Sarah's conviction that the goal of any intervention should be to preserve the family relationships that were clearly central to everyone's well-being, while ensuring that appropriate professional support was available to manage the medical complexities that exceeded the family's capabilities. The challenge would be finding and implementing solutions that honored both the safety requirements and the cultural values that shaped the family's approach to elder care. The truth revealed later that afternoon as Sarah sat in her empty classroom grading papers while substitute plans were implemented for the remainder of the week. She received a phone call that would reveal dimensions of the Rodriguez family crisis that she had not previously understood. The caller identified herself as Detective Lisa Park, a specialist in elder abuse cases with the Cedar Falls Police Department, and her serious tone immediately put Sarah on alert. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling because your name came up in connection with our investigation into Isabella Rodriguez's medication overdose," Detective Park explained. "We're required to investigate any case where an elderly person experiences this type of medical emergency, and I understand that you were the first person to identify concerns about Mrs. Rodriguez's medication management." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as she processed the implications of police involvement in the situation. "Detective Park, I hope you understand that this family isn't neglecting Mrs. Rodriguez intentionally," she said quickly. "They love her very much and have been trying to care for her at home, but they don't have the resources or expertise to manage her complex medical needs safely." "I appreciate that perspective," Detective Park replied diplomatically, "and I want to assure you that our investigation is focused on determining what support services might be needed, rather than looking for criminal activity. However, There are some aspects of this case that have raised questions that go beyond simple medication confusion. The detective's words sent a chill through Sarah as she wondered what additional complications might have emerged since her morning visit to the hospital. "What kind of questions?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "We've discovered that some of the medications Mrs. Rodriguez overdosed on were not actually prescribed to her," Detective Park explained. "The blood work shows significant levels of medications that are prescribed for other family members, including some that could be dangerous for someone with her medical conditions. We need to understand how she gained access to medications that should have been secured away from her." The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Isabella Rodriguez had been taking medications prescribed for other family members, the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. Drug interactions between medications prescribed for different people with different medical conditions could be potentially fatal, and the fact that Isabella had access to other people's prescriptions suggested serious gaps in medication security within the Rodriguez household. Detective Park, when I spoke with Carlos Rodriguez this morning, he mentioned that his wife Elena used to manage his mother's medications before she died, Sarah said, trying to piece together how the situation might have developed. "It's possible that medications from different family members got mixed together over time, especially if Mrs. Rodriguez's cognitive decline made it difficult for her to distinguish between different prescriptions." "That's certainly a possibility we're considering," Detective Park agreed. "But we've also learned that Mrs. Rodriguez has been taking some medications that were prescribed for her daughter-in-law who died 2 years ago. These are medications that should have been disposed of after Elena Rodriguez's death, but apparently they were still accessible in the household." The image of Isabella Rodriguez taking her deceased daughter-in-law's medications was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Sarah could imagine the elderly woman, confused by grief and cognitive decline, perhaps believing that taking Elena's medications might somehow maintain a connection to her lost family member or might address her own medical needs in ways that her prescribed medications were not. Has anyone explained to the family how dangerous it can be for someone to take medications that weren't prescribed specifically for them? Sarah asked, though she suspected that language barriers and cultural differences might have prevented effective communication about medication safety. "That's part of what we're trying to determine," Detective Park replied. "We need to assess whether the family understood the risks involved in keeping multiple people's medications accessible to someone with cognitive impairment, or whether this was a case of inadequate education about medication safety rather than willful negligence. The distinction between inadequate education and willful negligence was crucial, as it would determine whether the police investigation resulted in criminal charges or recommendations for support services. Sarah hoped that the cultural sensitivity that Carmen Valdez had demonstrated earlier would extend to the police investigation, ensuring that the Rodriguez family's lack of knowledge about medication safety was addressed through education rather than punishment. Detective Park, I think it's important for you to understand that this family has been struggling with language barriers and limited access to healthcare education, Sarah said, feeling compelled to advocate for Carlos and his family. Carlos works multiple jobs and may not have had opportunities to receive comprehensive information about medication safety, especially regarding the management of cognitive decline in elderly family members. I appreciate that context, Detective Park replied, and I want to emphasize that our goal is to ensure Mrs. Rodriguez's safety moving forward rather than to assign blame for what happened in the past. However, we do need to ensure that appropriate measures are taken to prevent future incidents, which may require more intensive supervision than the family has been providing. The conversation with Detective Park left Sarah with a deeper understanding of the complexity of the Rodriguez family's situation, but also with new concerns about the potential consequences of the police investigation. Even if criminal charges were not filed, the involvement of law enforcement would likely trigger additional scrutiny from Child Protective Services and might affect the family's eligibility for certain support programs. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon researching medication safety resources for families dealing with elderly relatives who had cognitive decline. She discovered that medication errors involving elderly individuals were far more common than she had realized, and that many families struggled with the same issues that had led to Isabella Rodriguez's overdose. The research also revealed that medication management for elderly individuals with multiple health conditions was extremely complex, requiring expertise that went far beyond what most family caregivers could be expected to possess. The combination of multiple prescriptions, potential drug interactions, and cognitive decline created a perfect storm for the kind of dangerous errors that had nearly killed Isabella Rodriguez. As Sarah prepared to leave school for the day, she found herself thinking about Maya and Sofia Rodriguez, who were presumably still staying with a neighbor while their father spent time at the hospital with their grandmother. The children had not only witnessed their grandmother's medical emergency, but were now dealing with the additional stress of police investigations and uncertainty about their family's future. Sarah made the decision to stop by the Rodriguez apartment complex on her way home, hoping to check on the children and offer any support that might be appropriate. She had the address from Maya's school enrollment forms, and she felt a responsibility to ensure that the children were coping with the traumatic events of the past 24 hours. The Maple Street apartments were located in an older section of Cedar Falls, with buildings that showed signs of deferred maintenance, but were kept reasonably clean and safe. Sarah found the Rodriguez unit on the second floor of a building that housed mostly Latino families, based on the names on the mailboxes and the sounds of Spanish conversation coming from various apartments. Sarah knocked on the door of apartment 2B, uncertain about who might answer or whether anyone would be home. After a few moments, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands who looked at Sarah with curiosity and mild concern. "Disculpe, are you looking for the Rodriguez family?" the woman asked in accented English, apparently recognizing that Sarah was not a typical visitor to the building. "Yes, I'm Maya's teacher from Riverside Elementary," Sarah explained. "I wanted to check on Maya and Sophia to see how they're doing after what happened with their grandmother. My name is Sarah Mitchell." The woman's expression immediately brightened with recognition and relief. "Oh, La Maestra. Maya talks about you all the time. I am Rosa Morales. I live next door. The girls are with me while Carlos is at the hospital. Please, come in." Rosa led Sarah into her own apartment, which was small but immaculately clean and filled with the scents of home cooking and fresh flowers. Maya and Sophia were sitting at the kitchen table working on coloring books, and Maya looked up with surprise and obvious pleasure when she saw her teacher entering the apartment. "Miss Mitchell," Maya exclaimed, jumping up from her chair to give Sarah an enthusiastic hug. "Mrs. Morales said that Daddy had to stay at the hospital with Abuela, but nobody told me if she was going to be okay. Is she still sick?" Sarah knelt down to Maya's eye level, noting that the child looked tired and stressed despite her excited greeting. "Your grandmother is going to be fine, Maya," she said reassuringly. "The doctors gave her medicine to help her feel better, and your daddy is staying with her to make sure she's okay. She should be able to come home in a day or two." Sophia, who had been quietly coloring at the table, looked up with the solemn expression that seemed characteristic of both Rodriguez children. At 6 years old, she was clearly aware that something serious had happened, but might not fully understand the implications of her grandmother's medical emergency. "Did Abuela take too many medicines again?" Sophia asked with the directness that children often displayed when discussing difficult topics. "Maya said that's why the ambulance came to our house." Sarah exchanged a glance with Rosa, who had been listening to the conversation while preparing what appeared to be dinner for the children. The neighbor's presence provided both comfort and appropriate supervision for this discussion, and Sarah was grateful that the children had been placed with someone who obviously cared about their well-being. "Your grandmother got confused about her medicines, and she took some that made her sick," Sarah explained carefully. "That's why the doctors had to help her, and that's why we're going to find better ways to make sure she takes the right medicines at the right times from now on." Maya nodded with the serious expression that Sarah had come to associate with the child's premature maturity. Mrs. Morales said that sometimes old people need special help with their medicines, and that doesn't mean their families don't love them or aren't taking good care of them. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude toward Rosa, who had apparently been providing exactly the kind of age-appropriate explanation and reassurance that the children needed during this difficult time. The neighbor's cultural understanding and bilingual capabilities had clearly been invaluable in helping Maya and Sophia process their grandmother's medical crisis. "That's exactly right, Maya," Sarah confirmed. "Sometimes when people get older, their brains work differently, and they need extra help to stay safe and healthy. Getting that help doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. It just means that we want to make sure everyone in the family is okay." Lalaisi. As Sarah spent time with Maya and Sophia in Rosa's apartment, she gained a fuller understanding of the support network that existed within the Rodriguez family's community. Rosa clearly served as more than just a neighbor, functioning as an extended family member who provided childcare, emotional support, and cultural continuity for the children when their father was unavailable. The apartment building itself seemed to function as a close-knit community where families looked out for each other's children and provided mutual support during difficult times. Sarah could hear the sounds of children playing in the courtyard below and the comfortable domestic noises of families preparing dinner, creating an atmosphere of safety and belonging that she hadn't expected to find in what she had initially perceived as low-income housing. Rosa explained that she had been caring for Maya and Sophia regularly since their mother's death, providing after-school supervision when Carlos was working his evening security job. The arrangement was informal but clearly well established, with the children comfortable in Rosa's home and following routines that had obviously been in place for some time. "Carlos, he is a good father, but he works very hard to take care of his family," Rosa told Sarah in her careful English. "When Elena died, many of us in the building started helping with the children, taking turns watching them when Carlos has to work. We are like family here, we take care of each other." This revelation provided Sarah with a new perspective on the Rodriguez family's situation, showing her that they were not as isolated as she had initially believed. The informal support network within their community had been providing crucial assistance with childcare and emotional support, but it had not extended to the specialized knowledge needed for managing Isabella's complex medical needs. As evening approached and Sarah prepared to leave the children with Rosa, Maya approached her with a question that revealed the depth of her continued concern about her grandmother's situation. "Miss Mitchell, will you help us make sure that Abuela takes the right medicines when she comes home?" Maya asked, with the earnest expression that had become familiar to Sarah over their weeks of interaction. "I know that's not really my job anymore, but I still want to help keep her safe." Sarah felt her heart swell with affection for this remarkable child who continued to demonstrate such maturity and compassion despite the traumatic experiences she had endured. "Maya, there are going to be special nurses who come to your house "To help with your grandmother's medicines," she explained, "but you can still help by being loving and kind to her, and by telling a grown-up if you notice that she seems confused or sick." The conversation with Maya reinforced Sarah's determination to ensure that the Rodriguez family received appropriate support services that would address both Isabella's medical needs and the children's emotional well-being. The goal was to preserve the loving family relationships while removing the inappropriate burden of medical responsibility from Maya's young shoulders. As Sarah drove home from her visit with the Rodriguez children, she found herself reflecting on the complexity of the situation that had begun with Maya's simple act of bringing pills to school. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of a child seeking help for a sick relative had revealed layers of family trauma, cultural challenges, economic hardship, and system failures that would require coordinated intervention from multiple agencies and service providers. The evening brought another phone call from Detective Park, who provided updates on the police investigation and shared information that added yet another dimension to the Rodriguez family's crisis. The detective had discovered that Isabella Rodriguez had been living in the United States without legal documentation, a fact that had significant implications for her eligibility for certain healthcare and social services. "This doesn't change our approach to the investigation," Detective Park assured Sarah, "but it does explain why the family may have been hesitant to seek help through official channels. Undocumented individuals often avoid contact with government agencies even when they desperately need assistance because they fear deportation or other immigration consequences." The revelation about Isabella's immigration status provided crucial context for understanding why the Rodriguez family had been struggling to manage her care without professional help. Carlos may have been aware that his mother's undocumented status could complicate her access to healthcare services, leading him to attempt to provide care privately rather than seeking help through official channels that might expose the family to immigration enforcement. This discovery also explained why Maya had brought the medications to school rather than suggesting that her father contact healthcare providers directly. The child may have instinctively understood that her family was reluctant to interact with official agencies, making school seem like a safer place to seek help from trusted adults. The immigration dimension of the Rodriguez family's situation added another layer of complexity to the development of appropriate support services. Carmen Valdez would need to identify resources that were available to undocumented individuals, and all service providers would need to be sensitive to the family's concerns about potential immigration consequences of seeking help. As Sarah processed this new information, she found herself even more convinced that her decision to become involved in the Rodriguez family's crisis had been appropriate and necessary. The combination of cultural barriers, language difficulties, economic constraints, and immigration concerns had created a perfect storm of circumstances that had prevented the family from accessing the help they needed through conventional channels. Maya's decision to bring her grandmother's medications to school had been an act of both desperation and wisdom, recognizing that her beloved teacher might be able to provide assistance that was not available through other sources. The child's trust in Sarah had created an opportunity to address a dangerous situation before it resulted in even more serious consequences for the entire family. The morning after her visit with Maya and Sophia brought Sarah face to face with a decision that would test every principle she held about professional boundaries and personal responsibility. As she sat in her car outside Riverside Elementary, watching the familiar stream of children and parents beginning their daily routines, her cell phone rang with yet another call that would complicate an already overwhelming situation. The caller was Maria Santos from Adult Protective Services, and her voice carried an urgency that immediately put Sarah on alert. Ms. Mitchell, I'm calling because we've encountered some significant obstacles in developing a care plan for Isabella Rodriguez. The family's immigration status has created complications with several of the service programs we typically rely on. And frankly, we're running out of conventional options. Sarah felt her heart sink as she absorbed the implications of Maria's words. The very system that was supposed to provide support for families in crisis was failing the Rodriguez family because of bureaucratic restrictions that had nothing to do with Isabella's medical needs or the family's willingness to cooperate with safety measures. "What kind of complications?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The intersection of healthcare, elder care, and immigration status created a web of regulatory barriers that often prevented the most vulnerable individuals from accessing essential services. Most of the medication management programs require participants to have either Medicare coverage or legal residency status, Maria explained with obvious frustration. The adult day programs have similar requirements, and even some of the home health services are restricted to documented individuals. We're essentially looking at a situation where an elderly woman's medical needs can't be safely managed within the existing system because of her immigration status. The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah. Isabella Rodriguez needed professional medical supervision precisely because amateur attempts at managing her care had nearly killed her. But the professional systems designed to provide that supervision were legally prohibited from serving her because of her undocumented status. The bureaucratic barriers created a catch-22 that left the family with no safe alternatives. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand the full scope of the crisis facing the Rodriguez family. Honestly, we're looking at a situation where Isabella may need to be placed in institutional care, not because her medical needs require that level of intervention, but because it's the only way to ensure her safety given the limitations on available services, Maria replied. The hospital can't discharge her back to an unsupervised home environment, and without access to appropriate community-based services, we're running out of options that keep the family together. The prospect of Isabella being placed in institutional care purely because of immigration-related service restrictions struck Sarah as fundamentally unjust. The elderly woman's medical needs were not severe enough to require nursing home placement under normal circumstances, but the artificial barriers created by her documentation status were forcing a separation that would be devastating for the entire Rodriguez family. Sarah found herself thinking about Maya's frightened question about whether her grandmother would be taken away, realizing that the child's fears were about to become reality despite everyone's best intentions to keep the family together. The systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable individuals were instead creating the very trauma they were designed to prevent. "Maria, there has to be another option," Sarah said, her voice carrying more emotion than she typically allowed in professional conversations. This family has been through enough without having to lose their grandmother to bureaucratic restrictions that have nothing to do with her actual care needs. "I agree completely," Maria replied with evident sympathy. "But I'm bound by the eligibility requirements of existing programs, and I can't create services that don't exist within the current system. Unless we can identify private resources or alternative funding mechanisms, I don't see a path forward that allows Isabella to return home safely." The conversation with Maria left Sarah feeling angry and helpless in ways that reminded her of the frustrations she had experienced during her husband's illness, when insurance restrictions and bureaucratic procedures had created obstacles to necessary care. The difference was that John had ultimately received the treatment he needed, even if the process had been needlessly complicated. Isabella Rodriguez was being denied access to care altogether because of circumstances entirely beyond her control. As Sarah sat in her car, processing this information, she found herself thinking about the resources she had available in her own life. Her divorce settlement had left her with a modest but adequate financial cushion, and her current living expenses were minimal enough that she could potentially afford to help fund some of the services that Isabella needed. The question was whether such personal involvement would cross professional boundaries in ways that could create more problems than it solved. The internal debate that followed was intense and complicated, touching on issues of professional ethics, personal responsibility, cultural sensitivity, and practical limitations. Sarah's teacher training had emphasized the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with students' families, but that training had not anticipated a situation where bureaucratic failures left a family with no legitimate alternatives. For addressing life-threatening safety issues, Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Principal Henderson approaching her car with the purposeful stride that typically indicated administrative urgency. Sarah rolled down her window as Henderson reached the driver's side, noting the concerned expression on the principal's face. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach you," Henderson said without preamble. "I just received a call from the district office about your involvement with the Rodriguez family. Apparently, the police investigation has raised some questions about appropriate professional boundaries, and the superintendent wants to meet with you this afternoon." The news that her involvement with the Rodriguez family had attracted negative attention from district administration added another layer of complexity to Sarah's already overwhelming situation. She had been so focused on addressing the immediate crisis that she had not fully considered the potential professional consequences of her deep involvement in the family's personal affairs. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, though she suspected that her visits to the hospital and the Rodriguez apartment complex had been perceived as overstepping appropriate teacher-student boundaries. "The concern is that you've become personally involved in a police investigation and a CPS case involving one of your students," Henderson explained carefully. "While everyone acknowledges that your initial response was appropriate, there are questions about whether your continued involvement is creating conflicts of interest or potential liability issues for the district." Sarah felt a familiar surge of frustration at the way administrative concerns about liability and public perception seemed to take precedence over human needs and moral obligations. She understood the district's position, but she also knew that stepping back from the Rodriguez family at this point would leave them without an advocate at a time when they desperately needed someone to help them navigate complex systems and bureaucratic barriers. "Principal Henderson, this family is in crisis precisely because the systems that are supposed to help them are failing," Sarah said, making no effort to hide her emotional investment in the situation. "If I step back now, Isabella Rodriguez could end up in institutional care, not because she needs that level of medical supervision, but because bureaucratic restrictions prevent her from accessing appropriate community-based services." Henderson's expression softened slightly, revealing the human concerns that existed beneath her administrative responsibilities. "Sarah, I understand your compassion for this family, and I don't disagree with your assessment of the systemic failures they're facing, but I also have to consider your professional standing and the district's potential liability if your involvement leads to unintended consequences." The conversation with Henderson crystallized the choice that Sarah was facing. She could step back from the Rodriguez family's situation, maintaining professional boundaries and protecting her career, while knowing that her withdrawal would likely result in the family's separation and Isabella's placement in institutional care. Alternatively, she could continue her involvement, risking professional consequences while potentially making the difference between the family staying together and being torn apart by bureaucratic failures. As Sarah drove to school for what would be her final day before the weekend, she found herself thinking about the various stakeholders whose interests were pulling her in different directions. The district administration wanted to minimize liability and maintain professional boundaries. The social service agencies were constrained by regulatory restrictions that prevented them from providing necessary services. The Rodriguez family needed advocacy and support to navigate systems that were failing them at every turn. Sarah's students deserved a teacher who was fully present and focused on their educational needs rather than distracted by external crises. Maya Rodriguez needed stability and normalcy in her classroom environment, while her family dealt with medical and legal complications. Isabella Rodriguez needed safe, appropriate care that honored her family's cultural values while ensuring her medical needs were met. The weight of these competing interests settled on Sarah's shoulders as she entered her classroom and began preparing for another day of teaching third-grade students who deserved her full attention, despite the crisis consuming her thoughts. She had not slept well the previous night, her mind cycling through possible solutions to problems that seemed to have no good answers within existing systems and structures. During her planning period, Sarah received a call from Carmen Valdez, the bilingual social worker who had been coordinating services for the Rodriguez family. Carmen's update provided both hope and additional complications as the family's situation continued to evolve in unexpected directions. Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to let you know that we've identified a potential solution for Isabella's care needs, but it would require a level of community support that goes beyond what we typically arrange, Carmen explained. There's a nurse practitioner in town who specializes in elderly care for undocumented individuals, providing services on a sliding scale basis. She's willing to work with the Rodriguez family, but the cost would still be significant for people with their income level. Sarah felt a surge of hope at the news that professional medical supervision might be available for Isabella, despite her immigration status, but the financial barriers remain daunting for a family already struggling to meet basic needs while supporting multiple households and medical expenses. What kind of costs are we talking about? Sarah asked, already calculating whether her personal financial resources might be sufficient to bridge the gap between what the family could afford and what the services would cost. The nurse practitioner charges $200 per week for daily medication management visits, plus additional fees for emergency calls and care coordination, Carmen replied. For a family like the Rodriguez's, that represents a significant portion of their total income, even with Carlos working multiple jobs. The amount was substantial, but not beyond Sarah's financial capabilities, especially if the arrangement was temporary, while other funding sources or service alternatives were identified. The question was whether providing such direct financial support would create dependency relationships or ethical complications that could ultimately harm rather than help the family. Carmen continued with additional information that complicated the financial calculations. We're also looking at costs for medical alert systems, medication dispensing devices, and possibly some home modifications to create a safer environment for someone with cognitive decline. The total package could easily reach $500 per month, depending on the specific services needed. The scope of the financial commitment required to keep Isabella safely at home was larger than Sarah had anticipated, but still within the range of what she could potentially afford for a limited period. The challenge was determining whether such an arrangement would be sustainable long-term, or whether it would simply delay inevitable institutional placement while depleting her personal financial resources. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her classroom door. Maya Rodriguez stood in the hallway, escorted by the school secretary, and her expression combined relief at being back in familiar surroundings with anxiety about her grandmother's condition and her family's uncertain future. "Maya, I'm so glad to see you," Sarah said warmly, gesturing for the child to enter the classroom. "How are you feeling today? How are Sophia and your daddy?" Maya approached Sarah's desk with the careful steps of someone who was trying to assess a complex emotional situation. "Daddy said that Abuela is feeling better, but she has to stay in the hospital for a few more days while the doctors make sure her medicines are working right," Maya reported. "Mrs. Morales is taking care of Sophia and me after school, and Daddy comes to see us when he's not at the hospital or at work." The child's factual recounting of her family's situation revealed both her resilience and her continued anxiety about circumstances beyond her control. Sarah could see that Maya was trying to maintain a brave facade while processing the trauma of her grandmother's medical emergency and the ongoing uncertainty about her family's future. "Maya, I want you to know that a lot of people are working very hard to make sure that your grandmother gets the help she needs and that your family can stay together," Sarah said gently. "It might take a little while to arrange everything, but the goal is to find ways for your grandmother to be safe and healthy at home with people who love her." Maya nodded with the serious expression that had become characteristic of her demeanor since bringing the pills to school several days earlier. "Miss Mitchell, can I ask you something?" she said quietly, glancing around to ensure that their conversation remained private. "Of course, sweetheart. You can ask me anything." "Are you in trouble because of what I did with Abuela's medicines?" Maya asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Morales said that sometimes, when teachers help families with problems, the school people get angry because it's not supposed to be part of teaching. Sarah felt her heart break at Maya's perceptive understanding of the professional complications that her cry for help had created. The child was already carrying an enormous emotional burden related to her grandmother's illness and her family's crisis, and now she was worried that her attempt to seek help had created problems for the teacher she obviously loved and trusted. "Maya, you did exactly the right thing when you brought those medicines to me," Sarah said firmly, kneeling down to speak with the child at eye level. "You recognized that the situation was too complicated for you to handle alone, and you asked for help from adults who might know what to do. That shows very good judgment and a lot of courage." Maya's expression remained troubled, despite Sarah's reassurance. "But if the school people are angry with you, maybe I should have found a different way to get help for Abuela. I don't want you to get in trouble because you were nice to me." The maturity and selflessness evident in Maya's concern for Sarah's professional welfare was both touching and heartbreaking. At 8 years old, Maya was demonstrating an understanding of adult responsibilities and consequences that spoke to the premature burden of caregiving she had been carrying within her family. "Maya, listen to me carefully," Sarah said, taking the child's hands in her own. "Whatever happens with the school administration has nothing to do with what you did. You saw that your grandmother needed help, and you found a way to get that help. The fact that adults sometimes make things complicated doesn't change the fact that you were brave and smart and caring." As Sarah spent time with Maya during the lunch period, helping the child process her emotions and providing reassurance about her family's situation, she found herself increasingly certain about the choice she needed to make regarding her own involvement. Maya's trust and courage in seeking help deserved to be honored with continued advocacy and support, regardless of the professional risks involved. The afternoon brought the anticipated meeting with Superintendent Davis, a session that would test Sarah's ability to articulate her position while maintaining respect for administrative concerns about professional boundaries and district liability. As she sat in the superintendent's office, surrounded by the formal trappings of educational bureaucracy, Sarah felt the weight of representing not just her own interests, but the needs of a family whose crisis had exposed systemic failures in multiple institutions. Superintendent Davis was a career educator in his early 60s who had built his reputation on maintaining stability and avoiding controversies that might attract negative attention to the district. His opening comments made clear that he viewed Sarah's involvement with the Rodriguez family as a potential source of complications that needed to be carefully managed. Ms. Mitchell, I want to begin by acknowledging that your initial response to Maya Rodriguez bringing medications to school was appropriate and professionally handled, Davis said, consulting notes on his desk. However, your continued involvement in the family's personal affairs has raised concerns about professional boundaries and potential liability issues that we need to address. Sarah had prepared for this conversation by researching district policies and considering how to frame her position in terms that would resonate with administrative priorities while maintaining her advocacy for the Rodriguez family. Superintendent Davis, I understand the district's concerns about liability and professional boundaries, she began carefully. But I also believe that we have a moral obligation to ensure that our response to student crises strengthens, rather, than weakens the families we serve. Davis leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's expression with the calculating gaze of someone trying to assess potential risks and benefits. Ms. Mitchell, the concern is not about your moral obligations, but about the scope of your professional responsibilities. Teachers are not social workers, and the district cannot be held liable for outcomes that result from staff involvement in matters beyond their training and authority. The conversation that followed was a careful dance between Sarah's passionate advocacy for the Rodriguez family and Davis's pragmatic concerns about institutional protection. Sarah found herself drawing on every skill she had developed as an educator and advocate, making the case that exceptional circumstances sometimes required responses that went beyond standard protocols. Superintendent Davis, the Rodriguez family, is facing a crisis that has exposed failures in multiple systems that are supposed to serve vulnerable individuals, Sarah argued. The immigration restrictions that prevent Isabella Rodriguez from accessing appropriate medical services represent a gap in our social safety net that leaves families with no legitimate alternatives for addressing life-threatening safety issues. Davis acknowledged the systemic problems that Sarah identified, but remained focused on the district's institutional interests rather than the broader social justice implications of the situation. Ms. Mitchell, while I sympathize with the family's circumstances, the district cannot become involved in addressing immigration policy issues or funding gaps in social services. Our responsibility is to provide educational services within appropriate professional boundaries. The meeting continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah making increasingly passionate arguments for continued involvement, while Davis maintained his position that professional boundaries needed to be respected regardless of the human costs involved. The conversation revealed fundamental differences in how they understood the role of educators in addressing student and family crises that extended beyond classroom walls. As the meeting neared its conclusion, Davis made clear that Sarah faced a choice between conforming to district expectations about professional boundaries or potentially facing disciplinary action that could affect her career prospects. The ultimatum was delivered diplomatically but unmistakably, leaving Sarah with no illusions about the professional risks involved in continued advocacy for the Rodriguez family. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to give you the weekend to consider your position, Davis said as he prepared to end the meeting. When we reconvene on Monday, I'll need your commitment that you'll maintain appropriate professional boundaries in your interactions with the Rodriguez family, or we'll need to discuss Alternative arrangements for your employment with the district. Sarah left the superintendent's office feeling both angry and determined, recognizing that the choice she faced was ultimately about the kind of educator and human being she wanted to be. The district's demand that she prioritize institutional protection over human need contradicted everything she believed about the moral obligations that came with positions of trust and authority. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment considering the choice that would determine not just her career trajectory, but her ability to live with herself, she received a phone call that would crystallize her decision. The caller was Carlos Rodriguez, and his voice carried a combination of gratitude and desperation that made clear how much her continued support meant to his family. "Miss Mitchell, I wanted to thank you for everything you have done for us," Carlos said, his accented English heavy with emotion. "The social worker. She told me about the nurse who might be able to help with my mother's medicines. But the cost is more than we can afford. I don't know what we will do if we cannot find a way to keep her at home." The pain in Carlos's voice as he contemplated his mother's potential placement in institutional care was heartbreaking, and Sarah found herself thinking about the choice between protecting her career and protecting a family that had already endured more loss than anyone should have to bear. "Carlos, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to help your family find a solution," Sarah heard herself saying, the words emerging before she had fully processed their implications. "Don't make any decisions about your mother's care until we've explored all the possibilities." After ending the call with Carlos, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of her carefully rebuilt life, thinking about the choice between safety and significance that she was facing. She could maintain professional boundaries, protect her career, and return to the comfortable routine that had sustained her since her divorce. Or she could risk everything to help a family whose crisis had awakened her to the possibility that her life might have meaning beyond personal survival. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of who she had always been beneath the protective shell she had constructed after her marriage failed. Sarah Mitchell had become a teacher because she believed in the power of education to transform lives, and she had stayed in the profession because she understood that real education sometimes required addressing the barriers that prevented children from learning and thriving. Maya Rodriguez had trusted her with her family's crisis because children had an intuitive understanding of which adults could be counted on to act with courage when courage was required. That trust deserved to be honored, regardless of the professional costs involved. As Sarah prepared for bed on what she knew would be her last night as a conventional elementary school teacher, she felt a sense of peace that had been missing from her life since the day her marriage collapsed. The choice between safety and significance was ultimately no choice at all for someone who had entered education to make a difference in the lives of children and families who needed advocates and allies. The morning would bring conversations with Maria Santos about funding Isabella's medical care, meetings with Carmen Valdez about coordinating services, and probably difficult discussions with district administration about the professional consequences of her decision. But for tonight, Sarah Mitchell was simply a teacher who had recognized that some situations required responses that went beyond policy manuals and professional boundaries. The story that had begun with Maya Rodriguez bringing strange pills to school was about to enter a new chapter, one that would test everyone's commitment to the principle that vulnerable individuals deserved protection, regardless of the bureaucratic obstacles that stood in the way of providing that protection. Sarah's decision to continue her involvement would create ripple effects that extended far beyond one family's crisis, challenging systems and institutions to live up to their stated values rather than hiding behind procedures that protected those in power while failing those in need. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.